coming to us from Minneapolis area in Minnesota. And welcome, George. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking some time to come on with our new podcast, Adventures in Bearland. I know you're not probably well versed in the Wildman, but we need your expertise on guys that came up to the Wildman's territory that were not regular guys in Ontario. So it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about some of these guys. We've got a ton of guys to talk about, so hopefully we can have you on 2 or 3 or 10 more times, and we can go from there.
2 or 3 or 10, okay. Yeah. Well, hey, it's good to be on with you. I always love talking to a fellow historian. When two historians get together, it's just a lot of chaos and pandemonium and excitement. So thank you.
I like the word magic. Yeah, it's magic.
Magic, it is. It is. We both can learn, and that's what this is all about, Wes. Man, I tell you what, just wrestling history.
So George, tell us about your Facebook pages and where you're on social media.
Well, I just mentioned history. You know, I spend every single day of my life doing something wrestling since I retired. And I'm serious about that. I'm researching results or records or whatever. But I have a Facebook page, George Schire's Wrestling Time Machine. And make sure you put it in exactly that way and join. And if you like wrestling before 1990 and going backwards, my place is the place to be, because I don't want to talk about anything after the world came to an end. And if you're interested in the AWA, which is kind of my main forte, I grew up around the AWA, but I have a book, Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors. It's published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And you can get it on Amazon. It's basically an AWA history. And the reason it's got Minnesota in the title is because it's published by the History Center. So they wanted Minnesota, but it covers the AWA. Lots of personal pictures, stuff in my own collection. And then I've got 3 AWA record books that are published. One for the 1960s, and 2 of them for the 70s, 1970 to 74, 75 to 79. Okay. And they're filled with all kinds of nostalgia, program pictures, personal pictures, but a lot of little tidbits on the wrestlers as you learn the results that took place. So they're fun books.
Cool.
And they too are on Amazon.
Awesome. I did not know that they were on Amazon, so we learned something new right off the bat.
There you go.
So yeah,
George, and they're getting slim in supply. Let me tell you, Mark James, who published them for me, out of Tennessee, Memphis. And he and I, we are not going to do an 80s book. We just decided we weren't going to. For some reason, the results don't sell great.
Okay.
But the 3 books that are there, personally, we're just fading them out. And I've got a small supply left and what's left on Amazon, and that'll be it.
Okay.
So there you go.
Cool. So yeah, as I said, George, I know you don't know necessarily anything about the Wildman or Gene Dubois or the Bearman or whatever we're going to call him. I'm just calling him the Wildman because that's what I like, to keep it simple. I know a lot of people in Ontario here call him the Bearman, and a lot of the WWA guys also called him the Bearman. And there was a really nice forward by Jimmy Valiant in one of the Detroit record books saying how much they enjoyed driving up the 401 to put in a few extra dates with the Wildman back in the early 70s also. So we'll be talking about that basically general area today. I know he was working in conjunction with Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder back in the 71, 72, 73. And he, I guess the boys all had a few days off and they'd travel up from Indianapolis to get another payday in Ontario for the Wildman. And it was pretty, I wasn't privy to any of those shows, unfortunately. I don't know if I ever told you, but I was a closet fan. And even if I had, the guys never came up to Toronto area anyways, very rare. They were mostly in London, Walsburg, Chatham, and Windsor. But yeah, so we're looking at some guys that they would have not normally seen, but you're an expert on some of these guys, and I've asked you to do a little bit of research, and we're going to start off with a guy who's been mislabeled so many times, George, right? Crusher Kowalski.
Oh boy. And by the way, you told me who we were going to talk about, so I'm just going to take it off the top of my head. How's that?
That's great.
Stan Kowalski, Stan Crusher Kowalski, Crusher with a K. Yeah, you're right. Talk about mislabeled. That I've never heard it put that way, but I think that says it. Stan was a guy that started wrestling in the 50s in Minneapolis. He was from Fridley, Minnesota, small suburb, and just a tremendous wrestler, a big guy, a heel, had the gift of gab right from the beginning. And he was one of those guys where he wasn't scientific. He didn't have a lot of smooth moves or anything, but he was a guy that he could get the fans to hate him. All he had to do was walk into the ring and give him a sneer or smart off to him, and the fans hated him. And in the later 50s, he hooked up with another great Minnesota wrestler out of Alberta, Canada. It was Tiny Mills.
Yeah.
Tiny was famous already for teaming with his brother, his older brother, Mr. Murder Mills. But Stan and Tiny got together in 1958, and they literally traveled around the world. They were in Japan, they were in Singapore, they were in Australia, and they gained what they called the International Tag Team Championship. They were in Honolulu. They came back up home here to Minneapolis, which at that point in time in 1959 was an early 60, was still under the NWA promotional umbrella in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis territory. So they came in as international champions. And then when the AWA was formed in August of 60, Vern Gagne, who had started the territory, moved away from the NWA, and he made Stan Kowalski, Crusher with a K, and Tiny Mills his first AWA World Tag Team Champions.
Oh, wow.
And they were the very first recognized AWA champions. And it was explained that they had been international champions and had NWA title championship recognition. So that's where Stan came from. But, you know, the thing with Stan is that he started running on the bad luck because for several years he was Stan Crusher Kowalski or Bildis Crusher Kowalski. Now, I will point out early in his career, he had some minor names in different areas. He was Sammy Silver for a while and Ivan Kola, Joe Zabisco for a very short nanosecond. But it was Stan Crusher Kowalski where he was making his name. His real name, simple. His real life name was Bert Smith. So, you know, it sounds a lot better to be Crusher Kowalski than in this corner, Bert Smith.
That's right.
But he, in 1962, when Reggie Lasowski came to the AWA and was now wrestling as Crusher Lasowski, going over big as a heel at the time. And Vern Gagne decided he can't have two Crushers.
Yeah.
And he took it upon himself to, Reggie was the one that was at that point drawing the money. I mean, huge money as a heel. And he ended up having a battle of the Crushers, and it was in Minneapolis. And the idea was the loser will give up the name, the Crusher name. Now, Crusher with a K and Crusher with a C, that's what it was. Well, you know, Stan was going to lose, and he got relegated by Vern to becoming simply billed as the Big K after that. And Stan was always funny. He said to me one time, he says, "What the hell's a big K? It's a capital letter." You know, I can't imitate Stan, but it was something similar to that. And it bothered him. He said, you know, he didn't like giving up the name. And he felt that Vern had slighted him at that point. And I think the relationship between the two of them was kind of strained after that. But he still had some pushes as the Big K. Then he went out east in 1970, and he hooked up with Vince McMahon Sr. And it was ironic because he wanted to come in as Crusher Kowalski or Stan Kowalski. And Vince Sr. said, "I can't have another Kowalski," because he had Killer Kowalski there at the time. And Stan told me, he said, I said, "Hey, put us together as a team or have us battle it out. You know, I can't use another Kowalski." So Stan was dubbed Crippler Karl Kovacs.
That's
three
right,
Ks. Three Ks, Crippler Karl Kovacs. He got a decent push. He did the usual thing where they built him up in all the towns, and then he got a couple title shots with Bruno, and then he'd go back down again. but he was crippler Karl Kovacs. Then he came back home here to Minneapolis for a little bit, and he eventually managed Kobayashi, Shozo Kobayashi from Japan, and then he had Ivan Koloff as his protege. And that was after Koloff had taken the title from Bruno in January of 71. So Stan had a good push. He was a tag team partner and manager to both of those wrestlers, and he really had a nice push. But it was always that I can't use my own name thing. And eventually, you know, as the 70s went on, Stan was getting lower and lower on the cards. He went to Oklahoma for a little bit, had a short run with, of all people, Kim Duck. And they were United States Tag Team Champions for Cowboy Bill Watts in the Mid-South when Bill and Leroy McGurk were promoting down there. But eventually, as you mentioned, he did some venturing into the WWA, which was Bruiser's territory in Indianapolis. And as that morphed into going up to, you know, the Bearman. And when you mentioned the Bearman, I want you to correct me because I think I'm correct on this. The Bearman was killed in the automobile accident that took Adrian Adonis, correct?
Correct, yes.
They were in the same car, and there was one other person in there. Who was it?
One of the Kelly twins.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Mike Kelly or Pat? Mike. Okay, so my memory was correct when you said I didn't know much about the Bearman, but that's where my introduction came. So that was the deal with Stan. So you have questions, I'll answer them for you.
Yeah, it's just the Wildman wrestled for Vince Sr. off and on throughout the late 60s.
Yeah.
And I think that's where he made the connections with some of these guys that were wrestling in back then. And I'm sure it was with Kowalski. I'm sure that was one of his connections. He had a connection with Carlos Colon, who was working there, and who came up and worked for him for a couple of summers around the same time. Also, Koloff came up a couple times, and Cicluna, who was one of his training partners when he was just starting out. So some of these guys that were in the WWF late 60s, early 70s ended up being part of his seasons, if you want to call it, because he only basically worked summer season, right? He did the touristy cottage country, smaller towns, everywhere that Frank Tunney didn't do anymore.
Okay.
So I've got a great picture, though. I didn't want to show it to you. I want to surprise you. So when we put this episode up, I'll put the picture on with it. It's a picture of you and Mr. Kowalski from a long time ago.
Well, I tell you what, Stan Kowalski, you know, one of the things that's a pleasure, and I think you probably recognize this too, we've been around this business long enough where the guys got to know us. They respected us because they knew we weren't going to blow kayfabe. Yeah. We helped their careers. I presented Stan with his life results record one time.
Okay.
And I will add to you, he said to me when I presented it to him, he said, well, you had me losing a lot of matches. I said, well, Stan, I just recorded the results, you know, because Stan was great. He could, any match he was in, the match was better because he was. And whether he won or lost, you know, the thing about wrestling, Larry Hennig told me one time, he says, I could lose every night and I draw people. So that's the name of the game.
That's right.
And that's the whole deal. But Stan, I tell you what, oh my God, what a friend. I got to know him personally. And I remember when I introduced my girlfriend to him, who became my wife, and we just had 50 years of marriage here in January. But when I introduced him, yeah, thank you. When I introduced him to my girlfriend, he looked, without missing a beat, he looked at her and he said, you could do better than him. I said, thanks for the encouragement, Stan.
Yes.
You know, but Stan was always, we'd go to lunch. Boy, I tell you, maybe half a dozen times over the years, I went to lunch with him, more in the later years, and just so much fun to be around. And I really, he's one of my favorite wrestlers just because he was such a genuine human being. And I got to know his son, Scott, and his daughter, Stacy, and they're just super kids. And I miss Stan, and I was honored. This is a special moment. When Stan passed away, they had a nice memorial service, and so many of the existing wrestlers that were still there and so much family. Scott asked me, his son Scott asked me to do the eulogy on Stan.
Oh, very nice.
And it was both enjoying and sobering.
Yes.
I remember that when I came back down after we were done, or I was done, I was actually sitting next to Larry Hennigan, his wife, Irene, and Larry looked over at me and he says, "Boy, you really put him over," you know. And
Yeah.
Larry, of course, was a longtime friend and opponent and tag team partner of Stan as well.
Yeah.
So that's my memories. And when any territory he went to, he really was an asset to it, wherever he could fit in the card, because he was just that kind of a talent. And so nothing but total respect. And if he worked for the Bearman had a main event guy on his card.
Well, he didn't do anything but main events.
Yeah, exactly.
They worked the circuit. It was mostly Tony Parisi and Tony Marino against Kowalski and Eric the Red. And
oh yeah.
In his circuit, he would do a Tony versus Eric, a Tony versus Kowalski, and then they come back with a tag next time, and they come back with either a cage or a strap match or a chain match or something. And I do have a couple little tiny little clips. I don't, unfortunately, some of my clips, I can't get back to the library to make bigger ones. So I do have some little clips, and there's Crusher Kowalski and Eric the Red versus.
The Red, and they would have been a great team.
Oh, two huge
Eric
guys,
Hansen
right?
And him. Oh yeah, yeah. That would have been a partner that I would have really enjoyed seeing. Yeah.
Eric was so over here because everybody knew that he was from here.
Yeah.
But he was a terrible heel, right? With the bone and the wild, absolutely wild hair. And I have some of his family on my Facebook groups, and they're just most awesome people, and they're really proud of their dad, even though he's been gone for so long, right? From another car accident victim in Florida.
That's right. And I want to, while we're talking about Stan too, I want to say something. One of the things that I always enjoyed was when you meet these guys, Stan usually played the heel role.
Yes.
But when you meet him outside the ring, and he was just a genuine human being. He fought hard and long for years for veterans' rights. Stan was very much into the veterans of the foreign wars. He was always involved with his Legion, and it meant so much to him. And he was very good at going to the veterans' homes, and and as a father, I tell you, his kids tell me that, man, dad was the best. And he was married to his wife, Cleo, for, boy, I tell you, I think it was close to 60 years or something. Uh-huh. And a little backstory on that. If you ever heard of the wrestler Blackjack Daniels.
Yes.
That was Stan's real life brother-in-law.
Oh, wow.
And Cleo was his sister. And so we often had in the AWA and other parts of the country, central states, it would be Stan Kowalski and Jack Daniels. And then down in Florida, a little bit of a tidbit, Stan and Jack Daniels were the very first ever recognized Florida Southern Heavyweight champions in 1967, when they were both down there. Jack mostly did lower card matches for the AWA, but a great worker. And Jack was also Jack Mills, teamed with Tiny as a brother. Okay. So they had a connection there, the three of them, for a long time.
And that's why we do this, George. That's why we do this. I like to think that I know a lot, and I know you do know a lot. But all the times that we've talked on the different podcasts that we've been on and things, it's just awesome to say, oh, this popped into my mind, and then you learn something new. Now, anyone who's followed results and ads like I have, I've seen Blackjack Daniels, and darn well Tootin. How many people know that?
Yeah. Well, and he wrestled also, you'll see some results, Ripper Daniels.
Yeah.
He wrestled as Ripper Daniels. His real name was Danielson. Last name was Danielson.
Okay.
But Blackjack Daniels, he was the first Blackjack in the AWA. He had that name in the early 60s.
Okay.
And he and Stan often teamed in the AWA. Nobody knew they were brother-in-laws.
Yeah.
But there it is.
We move forward, sir, to 1972, and we've got a clip here of a show in London. These are mostly London shows because it was his biggest town
Sure.
outside of Toronto. And we got Heenan and Mulligan versus Rossitani and Jean Dubois, who was one of the Wildman's other names. That's also Eric the Red and the Kelly twins on that card. And here we've got this is a massive WWA card with a lot of your guys from AWA on it. Blackjack Mulligan versus Prince Pullins in a chain match. Vic Rossitani, who also worked in the AWA, he's a Hamilton boy, versus Bobby Heenan in a chain match. And then we got Eric the Red versus Gene Dubois, Baron von Raschke against Chief Red Cloud. And he just brought these guys in, and they were so huge. And I remember fans telling me about the shows at the London Arena, like 1,500 people hanging from the rafters, week after week after week after week. It was his the Bearman's. It was his glory days, for sure.
I will point out to you that Eric Hansen, Eric the Red, he did work for Vern in the later 60s.
Okay.
But he never got a push. He was usually a TV enhancement guy or low on a card. We had some cards where he must have just come in for a short time.
Okay. Moving through either out west or back east.
Could have been. Yeah. So a couple of those cards that you pointed out there, obviously, Bearman brings in Bobby Heenan. I mean, oh my gosh, what can we say about Bobby Heenan that hasn't been said? And no matter what you say, you can't say it all. Because the man literally, I tell you what, if anybody ever just talks wrestling and doesn't include Heenan in a conversation, it's almost like the conversation just doesn't make sense, because Bobby Heenan was so good. Every wrestler I ever talked to, Wes, that was around Bobby Heenan. I mean, obviously there were some that never worked around him, didn't know him, but he knew so many. And any one of them will always tell you, Bobby was the best. And Bobby wasn't even a real, he didn't start out to be a wrestler. He started out as a ring guy for the Bruiser in Indianapolis. As a teenage kid, he'd carry the ring jackets back to the locker room when the guys took him off in the ring introductions. And he just wanted to be around wrestling. He used to cut Dick the Bruiser's lawn when he was a kid. I mean, that's how he got into the business, just hanging around the Bruiser. And then his managing career, oh my gosh, it's absolutely legendary. And any wrestler of any merit, if they were hooked up with Heenan, they were automatically elevated. Any wrestler they were, even if they were great wrestlers, now they were greater.
Yeah. And
I noticed you pointed out Mulligan there. Blackjack Mulligan. We had Bob Windham here in the AWA in 1969 and 70. And he came here to get some additional training from Vern Gagne after his football career. Yeah. And Vern didn't train him, but he had the opportunity to work with Vern and all of the different wrestlers that Vern had in the territory. So we had Bob Windham, who was just a big guy. But he was one of those guys that when you looked at him, I swear to you, and I was in 1970, I was 19 years old. And I looked at him, I said, God, this guy is good. He had the size, he had the moves. And ironically, he was usually in the babyface role as Bob Windham. And more often than not, one of his major opponents on a regular basis was Blackjack Lanza.
Okay.
And so it was ironic in 1970, it would have been November of 70, Bob Windham went to Japan with Larry Hennig. And Larry, of course, was a great heel. Yeah. And they went over to Japan. They actually won the, they won the IWA title over there as heels. And then after the tour in November of 70 was over, Hennig came home here to Minneapolis, and Bob Windham all of a sudden showed up in January in the WWF, which it was still the 3 Ws. Vince Sr. dubbed him Blackjack Mulligan. And he literally was a carbon copy of what Lanza's character was. Yes. The black boots, the black tights with the horseshoe on the back, the black hat, the black vest, and of course the mustache, and there was no correlation between the two blackjacks at that point in time. He had his run, Mulligan did, with Bruno, or it wasn't with Bruno. He was the first challenger, I think, for Morales.
For Pedro,
when Pedro won the title from Koloff. And Mulligan got the first push there as the big heel. But eventually he started coming back to working for Bruiser. Mulligan did. And then it was only natural. Lanza was also working a lot for Bruiser in 72, 73 timeframe there. And the two blackjacks got together. They ended up going back out to the East Coast in 74, 75. They won the tag team title. I think they won them from Tony Parisi Louis Cerdan and Gino Brito. Yeah. I don't know if I ate breakfast this morning and I throw this stuff out. So, but they just had a great run, the two blackjacks. But Mulligan, he was more and more getting to be on his own and forming his own career. So you had him a little bit up there with Bearman, and then we know he went down to Texas. Him and Lanza were there together for Fritz in 1976, 77 timeframe. And then Mulligan was in the South, and the rest of his career is legendary. I mean, but they hooked up with Heenan when they went to Bruiser's group, the Blackjacks. And in Chicago, they had a lot of blackjack matches against the Crusher and the Bruiser, because Chicago was the unique AWA city that was also co-promoted with Dick the Bruiser's WWA, because Vern and Bruiser owned Chicago.
Which was bizarre, but on the same note,
it was a very bizarre thing. But I know when I look at results, I'm always envious, because we'll see a lot of AWA talent, and then we'll see a lot of WWA talent. And it was the only city that got blackjacks against Crusher and Bruiser. We never got that in the entire AWA.
Yeah.
But a Chicago AWA fan and WWA fan got those matches, and they were bloodbaths. Of course, it's Chicago. I think blood was in the contract. You had to believe.
I know. I've seen some WWA matches with Manicure, who I don't know about anyone else. I didn't like Manicure whatsoever. I didn't think he was that great, but he did his job in the WWA. Yeah. But some of the matches with Heenan and the Blackjacks there were phenomenal, and the raw talent of Heenan was incredible, with the working the gimmicks, working the and he could flop around like a dead fish, like flop. Oh, yeah. Flop.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And he did that over the turnbuckle, flip out onto the ground, which so many guys have done, but lots of guys couldn't really do it that well. Then he went sailing.
Bobby Heenan did it with such ease and grace and made it look so easy and so, oh my God, look at, he's going to kill himself, Yeah. And of course, it always appeared that he was tossed or, thrown over. I mean, and he went with it to make it really work great. Bobby Heenan, and like we said, any wrestler he worked with, the wrestler was automatically elevated. His time with, you talk about Mulligan again, let's just keep on him for a moment. When he was in the AWA, one of the great things about the territories in general was there was always so much talent in each territory, and a wrestler could go in and pick and choose from different wrestlers what worked for them, take from them, different things for their own character.
Yes.
And when Wyndham was here, not only did he get a lot from Jack Lanza, because he was copying Lanza, almost from the get-go, and they became good friends. But working with guys like, he's in the territory, Bob Wyndham, with Paul Diamond and Dr. X and the Crusher and Stan Kowalski, he was here, and Ivan Koloff and all these guys, Nick Bockwinkel. I mean, Don Morocco was here. How do you not become good when you're around that group of talent? And then you throw in Bobby Heenan, who at the time when Wyndham was here as Bob Wyndham, Bobby Heenan was Lanza's manager. So there were times when we'd see Lanza versus Wyndham and Bobby's in the corner.
Wow.
I mean, and I look at the results from the AWA and boy, they wrestled a lot against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen
that I'll point out is the fun thing of doing results, because you follow a wrestler, you see what they did night after night, year after year. You see the character changes, and sometimes a good guy, sometimes a bad guy, this name, that name, wrestled his opponent last night. He's teaming with him tonight somewhere else. I mean, oh man, results are storytellers.
I love them. I just, it's been my thing since like the early 70s. I may have been a closet fan because I never went to shows, but I certainly wasn't a closet fan when it came to looking at results and looking at ads. I just absolutely love them. My favorite thing. I spend probably, I work full time still, and I do all the other things a husband and has to do. I spend probably 4 to 6 hours a week on the internet looking for trying to find results that nobody else has. And it's just the most exciting thing in my world. I absolutely love it. I'm embarrassed to say that because.
Well, and I will tell you, I've been doing results since I was about 20 years old. And I did it, I started doing it the old fashioned way, where I had to go to the libraries and go to microfiche and old newspapers. And I used to do a lot of traveling when I was 20, 21, 22, 23. I had no problem driving to Omaha on a spur of the moment, or going to Indianapolis on a spur of the moment, or down, to Milwaukee or wherever it was, one of the small spot shows, whatever. But whenever I did this, I always made sure I could hit a library, because I'd pick apart some paper, and I teased. I said, I found cards in cities I didn't even know were cities, and they're so much fun. And like I mentioned earlier with my results books, as much fun as they are, they're a labor of love. Sadly, they just really don't sell that well, because I think you and I loving results, we're an oddity. A lot of people just can't take a book and read card after card and look at the results. It doesn't mean anything to them.
I could pull up something here. What was the chap's name from the AWA area that passed away a couple years ago? Jim Melby?
Jim Melby is where I learned results.
He put out some beautiful, beautiful booklets.
He used to do, Jim, when I met Jim, long story short, we don't want to go into a big one here, but I met Jim when I was 17. He was 19. We lived in the same city. We started going to the matches together. We shared a ringside seat next to each other. We traveled together, did spot shows together. And Jim used to keep the index cards, and he had them in shoe boxes. And he had card after card after card from a territory or a city. And at first, when I saw them, I thought, excuse me, I said, wow, that's crazy. But I just learned, and I always say I learned from a master, because Jim started doing his wrestling results. And that's how I met Jim. He was putting out a very archaic at the time, state of the art for the era, but a bulletin called Wrestling Results. And that's all it was, is wrestling results. And I don't know, about the third issue or something, I became his assistant editor, and I was doing a column in there, George's Grappling Gossip or something, if I remember right. I still have the issues, but that's where I learned it from. And Jim showed me the importance. And then when he started doing his results records of wrestlers, I got hooked on it. And now I've done about, I don't know, close to 100 different wrestlers' life records, of which I will tell you are never done, completed. Because just when you think you got them all, oh my God, I just found 3 results. It's like Christmas morning, opening the package, Santa gave me what I wanted. So yeah, I'm a results freak.
I have recently, and I'm still looking for Wildman clippings and ads and results. And I've been going to the libraries since probably 1986. So not that long, but long enough. And I hit most of the libraries in Southern and Southwestern Ontario, because it's just what I love to do. And I was on the internet a few weeks ago, and I had my little booklet with his records that I have in a booklet form. And I thought, there's big space missing. You'll know this. There's a big space missing there from say May the 15th to June the 6th. Like he didn't just stop promoting.
Right.
So I dug a little deeper. I found a web page that had Newfoundland results. Bingo. It took me 15 minutes to find one. And I was like, and the ad had also coming to, and it had 3 towns at the bottom and the dates.
See, and I know you're feeling, it's just a euphoria I can't explain.
Oh my God, that's great.
I know it. So do you actually have a Bearman record book put together then? Or?
Yeah. Unfortunately, though, I have it right here. I keep it very handy. And as you can see, it's all pen and paper. It's not.
Well, that's cool, man.
There's thousands, and I'm just going to quickly show you because 1974 was the year that the Stomper Archie Goldie came to Ontario, and you can see there's not any more room to put in there.
No,
there's nothing.
That's crazy. I love it.
And I found another one last week. So where do I squeeze it in? The tiniest little writing, but yeah, I would do it for free for the rest of my days.
See, not only do I have them in binders, all my results records, but I also have individual file folders in file cabinets of all the wrestlers, and I do their results records and I keep them in their individual files. So it's like I'm at the point right now where if you just name a wrestler, I can go to the file cabinet, pull it out, and I got all this stuff. I can tell you where they were, who they won, who they lost, what year, and I live for it. I'm sick. Nick Bockwinkel, I've told this story, but it's just so Nick. He walked into my wrestling room one time years ago. He come around the corner, and just as you walk in the room, and he just looks around and he goes, "You're sick." Because it's ceiling to floor, wall to wall, photos, framed photos, posters, memorabilia things, and then all the records and everything. And Nick, he just says, glad we got it, people like you, because we never saved this stuff.
Yeah.
Most of the wrestlers, they didn't save it. They just, and the story, it deserves to be retold. They traveled so much by car in those days, in that era. And they'd go 200-300 miles, from tonight wrestling and then to the next town, and then do the same thing tomorrow night. And he said, that's what we did. We never had a chance to stop and look at the program or get a picture or whatever. We never saved it. So, when guys like you and I come along and we can share something like this, most of the guys, I tell you, they're just thrilled. They're just thrilled. Red Bastien just about died. He said, "Oh my God, I don't believe I'm looking at this stuff," and that's a compliment, but it's rewarding.
Yes. And my buddy Jesse, that's one of the things we did on our 5 pages that we offered. You need some help with something, you need to find something about your uncle, your grandpa, your dad, your whatever. And I'm still digging up Kurt Von Hess records for his daughter Paige.
Paige, yeah, nice lady too.
Super lady.
Yes, yes.
This is keeping it alive. This is keeping history alive, and this is why I want to do this podcast. Nothing against anybody else, but this is what I would consider to be my area of expertise, and I want to dig so deep into this guy's career and his life. Not just he wrestled here, he wrestled there, he did this, he did that, but I want to look at his life also because, from the highest of highs of making a ton of money and having lots of famous people on his independent promotion for over 30 years, right. And then having all the tragedy that also befall him with his live-in girlfriend being killed by the bear and then dying unceremoniously on a highway in the wilderness in Newfoundland, right? But so it's keeping it alive, keeping wrestling history alive. And I know we've spoke on other podcasts, George, that's what is important.
Well, Wes, the thing that is interesting is that we can pull out a lot of names sometimes, and unless someone is our age or older or close to our age, those names don't usually mean anything to them. The mindset today is that unless a guy held the world title 19 times, and he was a main event everywhere he went, and that he had the championship all the time, that's the only wrestlers there were.
And the thing is, effing piece of glass.
Right. And I like to look at the guys who, like when we were talking Stan Kowalski. Stan held a lot of titles in his day, but Stan was a journeyman wrestler. Whatever territory he went into, wherever he was placed on a card, that card, as I said earlier, was better because Stan brought credibility to it. And whether he lost or he won, whatever job he was supposed to do that night, he was a credit to the business. And every guy that worked with him, they say, "Oh, I'm working with Stan Kowalski. Great. Stan's a good hand." Those guys don't get the recognition.
No.
And you showed a clipping a moment ago with Vic Rossitani. Oh my gosh. You want to just pull a name out of the hat? Vic Rossitani. He wrestled under different names.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't know that. He was Vic Rossitani. He was Vic Rossi. He was Vic Mueller. I think he might have had a couple of others wherever he was in the territory. And he wrestled for Vern, excuse me, but he was that good of a hand on a card that he didn't have to be in the constant main event. And that's why when we do this research and when we talk about some of these guys, like we mentioned Mulligan. Well, you want to talk about Mulligan from the beginning, the guy lost 100 zillion matches before he became Mulligan.
Yeah.
That didn't mean he wasn't good.
That's right.
He was getting better.
Learning his craft.
And he learned it well. And even as Bob Windham, he was a heck of a talent on the card.
I have Vic Rossitani's two sons on our groups, and they'll be happy to hear you mention his name also. So that's nice.
Well, he was one of those guys when I saw him wrestle for Bill Watts when I was in Oklahoma one time on a trip, and he was Vic Mueller down there.
Yeah.
And then he did come up and work for Vern for a while in the 70s as Rossitani. And he was mid-card. He wasn't getting a push, but his matches, you could tell whoever his opponent was that they were good. They each made each other better.
Yeah.
And Rossitani, you throw that name out though, was he a world champion? Did he have 110 championships in every city he went? No. But does he deserve to be recognized? You better believe he does.
Darn right he does, yeah. Awesome. I just want to quickly show you a couple other ones. Now, did you ever see Ernie Ladd up in the AWA?
Oh, yeah. Ernie Ladd, actually, I will tell you that in 1967, Larry Hennig and Harley Race were our hot team. And Ernie Ladd was brought in by Vern Gagne as a babyface on the off season when Ernie was playing football for the Kansas City Chiefs. And he was wrestling in the off season, so he was a babyface. And he even teamed with Vern Gagne against Hennig and Race. He also had Ladd team with Earl Maynard, Mr. Universe, for a while. But Ernie had a good run here. He wrestled most of our heels, had it run during the summer. He was off, or during the off season for football. And I don't remember when he exactly quit football full time, but
it would have been around 65, 67.
I was going to say it was getting close to the end of his career, but he was still, I'm pretty sure he still played some for the Chiefs or was under contract to the Chiefs.
Yes.
I know he played for San Diego too, football.
Yeah.
And but as a heel, we never got to see him here. I did see him one time when I was out in Boston as a heel. And oh my God, what a monster. What a great, and the gift of gab that he had.
Yeah, he was great.
And again, a guy that, of course, he had the size. The guy was 6'9" high, but just a great guy. And I will tell you, I had the opportunity at the end of his career, I had the opportunity to actually sit down and talk with him at Cauliflower Alley. And it was shortly before he passed away. And I didn't know when he was talking to us that he had had cancer.
Okay.
Just a very quiet, low key. He had become religious at that point.
Yes.
He was throwing a little religion out, which I have no problem with. I am very believer of God, but he had turned to religion, and I think he was coming to peace with himself, with whatever his life had brought him. And but I enjoyed the time, and just a credit to the business and what he did. Wrestling so many great baby faces. And we saw him in Bruiser's group. He teamed with Baron von Raschke and had Bobby Heenan as their manager.
Yep. That's what they would have come up with during that time frame, 72, 73.
And they were WWA champions for a while.
Ladd was awesome. We got to see Ladd a lot in Southern Ontario because he was a mainstay in Buffalo for Pedro Martinez. And then he also worked not as much as regular in Toronto, but he was on TV every day from Buffalo. And he was just, him and Johnny Valentine were just crazy draws for Pedro Martinez, and fantastic on the television. He was really, but let alone his ventures into WWF, which we can still see, right?
Sure.
With jawing with Vince Jr.
Yeah, one of the things that I think was important about Ladd too, and it may be out there. There was an interview one time with Bill Watts, and Bill had Ernie Ladd as one of his big stars down in the Mid-South. And Bill made the comment, Bill Watts had issues at times where people said he was racist, and he didn't, but Bill Watts, he made it very clear, if this interview's out there, he said, Ernie Ladd showed me what being black was and what he had to go through, the trials, the tribulations, how hard it can be, but he also showed me the emphasis on how a black wrestler could be important to the business. Yeah. And when he was in Louisiana and Oklahoma, you have to remember at the time that the population base was, African American a lot. Yeah. But Ernie Ladd was great. And Bill Watts, he said, I have nothing but the utmost respect for Ernie the Cat Ladd. It was one of his heroes.
I enjoyed him immensely. I didn't, back when I was a kid, I thought he was really entertaining. He wasn't one of my favorite wrestlers, but he was really entertaining. He could, another guy could talk them into the building for sure, right?
Well, I think he was one of those guys, Wes, where, I saw him primarily as a babyface, as I mentioned to you, when Vern brought him into the AWA, and he was over. He was put over because of his size.
Yes.
He was a lot thinner back in 65, 66, 7. He had the crew cut at that point. He didn't have the beard or the fuzzier hair that he had, come later. But he was over as a baby. But when he transitioned into a heel, wow, he found it. And any promoter, I mean, he's just one of those guys that if you're a promoter and you say, okay, despite any of my feelings I might have, if I want to draw fans, who do I want to put on my card? Well, I'd put Ernie Ladd on the list and say, Ernie, I want you. We're going to do business together, and I love you, man. Let's do it.
I remember going through results when there was no internet, and people would give you fanzines or bulletins, and you'd be looking, and remember the magazines had the go where the action is.
Yeah, and just clippings with no dates on them or years or anything. It's like, help me here, would you?
Ladd and Valentine, St. Louis, California, Texas, Toronto, Montreal, Detroit, and then the same thing again. I think they were immensely popular. Yeah, even for bad guys.
And he did a lot of traveling.
Yeah.
So all the guys that we talk about, I mean, just what great assets to this business wherever they worked. Mm-hmm. And they just can never get enough kudos to me.
Yeah. George, I want to thank you so much for coming on with us today. And we're going to have you back again. I'll give you another list of 3 or 4 guys, and we can just reminisce and talk about them, guys that came up to work from either from the WWA or guys that were maybe considered more famous in the AWA territories over the time, and eventually ended up coming here in Dave's summer season. So thank you very much. I shake your hand virtually from up here in wintry Manitoba to down there in wintry Minnesota.
Yeah,
as usual, sir. It's been all my pleasure.
Hey, thank you so much. I love
Thank you.
talking with you because, like I said, fellow historians, we're married, buddy. I love it.
Awesome.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, George.